in the previous clip, in the previous video, um, I told you that the indictment was blank, which you probably did not even know. That's a big deal. Why was the indictment itself blank? That's what this particular, that's what this video is going to be about. Why did they leave the indictment blank? Why not allege some actual details? Now, I want you to remember, Jim's Little Johnson, the badged foreskin, told the press, therefore he told you, that there were 8 so-called victims. Well, guess what? He lied. So the first question is, do you even care about that? Do you care about whether or not your elected sheriff tells the truth? You know, a law enforcement officer tells the truth. Or, in this case, do you care that he completely fabricates his own lie? Does that matter to you, or do you find yourself making excuses for him? In other words, well, he's law enforcement, so who cares? If you do find yourself making excuses for him, or if you're not completely repulsed by those kind of tactics, especially from a law enforcement officer, then really it says a lot more about you than it does him. Now, I already knew he was a liar, so, you know, what's your excuse? So he told you publicly, he said 8 victims, and you believed him. Well, why did you believe him? Just because he has a shiny badge, that's why. He also presented it to you in kind of a huge official news conference, as if he was announcing some sort of a major sting, citing the diligent work of an entire quote-unquote joint task force, as if they'd been working some deep investigation for a really long time, which resulted in a sting on a karate instructor, as if they'd wrapped up some major cult leader, you know, Waco style, and you believed him. Well, why? So let me show you something that you have not seen, something which was not part of that public record. What should be appearing on your screen right now is from that task force's very own notes. This, in the normal scheme of things, would be part of what's called the legal discovery process, something that they actually tried to hide from me, which also, by the way, that's also illegal. But the entire time I was sitting in that jail with a $1 million bond, I was entirely clueless as to exactly what they, and I'll get to who the they is or were, are, because that's very, very relevant here. What exactly were they trying to allege? What specifically was the quote-unquote fondling accusation? What the hell were they talking about? Why leave the indictment blank? Why not put details in there? If you're going to allege a crime, you have to allege the details. Why did they not? So, since the arrest affidavit actually left absolutely no clue, and since the indictment itself was blank, what exactly am I defending against? I got no notice as to exactly what I was defending against. That's why getting the actual investigative notes was very, very critical to me. That's where I learned exactly what they were going to try to allege, the investigative notes. Why did they leave the arrest affidavit devoid of details? Why leave an indictment blank? Why did they not describe some sort of alleged illegal behavior? Well, the answer is actually very simple. Because there wasn't any. There were no details. It alleged no details because there were no details to describe. I had been running through a million things in my mind to determine what the hell were they going to try to claim? Nothing. But part of the reason that case against me was so weak and was falling apart was that it was really actually very, very silly. The only thing which they were trying to cling to as, quote, illegal behavior was a claim so silly, so asinine, so insane and impossible, really, that it really would have been laughed completely out of court. But first, let me try to explain what it is you're looking at on your screen. This is the actual investigative notes, as written in the actual hand. This is the handwriting of the officer who was right there
This call is from a federal prison.
Contemporaneous notes of the interview of one of the two so-called accusers. Now, I'm not going to use their actual names of the puppeted kids here, who were indeed students, so I'll just simply call them Miss Yellow and Miss Orange. That was their belt rings. The notes that you actually see here in the handwriting are from the actual interview with the student Miss Orange. I believe the note taker herself was, quote, Detective Lynette Sandlin, Sandlin. But I could be wrong about that. The note taker is definitely a right-handed, educated female, as you can see by the handwriting, who's very detail-oriented and organized, with likely a kind of a logic-based cognition. But the interviewer, I believe, is someone by the name of Marie Steele, L-E. As the note taker noted in the upper right-hand corner. Now, the blacked out parts are the name of the interviewee, Miss Orange. Now, a word on Miss Orange herself. Now, while I detest false accusations in such people, especially accusations like this, by the way, are disgusting. They're the lowest of the low. In my mind, they're the scum of the earth, false accusers, particularly when they're perpetuating the weaponization of the prosecutorial system or the press. I believe, like prosecutor Mike Nifong and his false accuser puppet against the Duke lacrosse team, I think they should be in prison for life. So should Anita Hill and Christine Blasey Ford and that fake Trump accuser who couldn't even say what year she was trying to allege. They all should be in prison. And I think the prosecutors should get the death penalty and a violent one too. Judges who let those kind of cases go forward in their courtrooms, they should be publicly tarred, they should be feathered, they should be fired. There should be a national registry with the sole purpose of constant public shaming of all of those people that get involved in that kind of weaponization. However, in the specifics of Miss Orange here, I'm going to allow that this was not really her fault. In fact, I know that it wasn't. Like Miss Yellow, she was just simply a tool being manipulated by their trusted adults who were abusing them for this purpose. And wait until you learn, by the way, who those trusted adults were. You're going to say, oh my God, and that's when it'll all come together for you. But anyway, Miss Orange herself, she was actually one of those absolute prodigy type students. That's very, very rare. She would have had a very serious, very bright future ahead of her. This was one of those rare kind of naturally skilled, very intelligent, fast learners who could quickly do, and with ease, what others at her level, struggle to do. She was one of those who would have passed every single belt exam that she got to with perfect scores. And honestly, I hadn't taught a student like that since the 1990s. Someone named Sarah, who went on to win an Olympic gold medal, by the way, and in front of the world in a completely different sport. But prior to Miss Orange, the closest thing I had to that was an outstanding student who I was, contemporaneously coordinating actually a very prestigious university scholarship for, which, as a result of my arrest, by the way, she's never going to get that scholarship.
This call is from a federal prison.
I was the sponsor. She was never going to be able to use, therefore she got horribly screwed by my arrest, betrayed even by one of my own people, and another who was coming up right behind her, easily at the elite level. But back to Miss Orange. She might have even surpassed that. Though it's kind of hard to be certain that early on. She was only an orange belt level, which means she was really just a few months into her training. But what she did have was kind of a serious problem with her eyesight, but I think she would have figured that out. Anyway, the first thing I want you to notice on these notes, these handwritten notes by the actual interviewer from the task force, is the date on the upper left-hand corner. Now, I want you to notice, it says this interview was on January the 18th of 2013. This is very important for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that is the reason that you'll only see if you look at the big picture. I mean, the bigger picture. Only the smart pattern recognition people, the analytic types, they're going to be able to see the relevance of the data in the scheme of things. This was only 1 week. 1 week after my very brief, essentially one-day trip to D.C., meeting with members of the Intelligence Committee for the pre-hearing interviews on Benghazi. Those meetings were on January 10th, and I remember that very well because it was my mother's birthday. I'd even swapped vehicles for that trip with the with a student, one of my instructor staff, the one who was actually going to get that scholarship. Anyway, the second reason that it's really important that that date should strike you as a WTF is that it was literally the day before my arrest. In other words, the interview was on the 18th, and I was arrested the very next day. So that's how long the so-called deep investigation by the dedicated Joint Task Force actually lasted. That deep investigation lasted less than a day. So this so-called Joint Task Force that Jim's Foreskin Johnson presented to the press, well, as you can see, it was BS. They hadn't even been working on this case. There had been no deep investigation. It was a farce. It was phony. It was just kind of cobbled together for the sake of his TV cameras, and you ate it up. On the 19th, they announced this major sting, which resulted from some deep, long investigation, but that was a lie. Now, they did do a very overpowering sting-type arrest. There were cop cars everywhere, but there was no investigation. It was just one interview, this one, which had just happened. You can't make this crap up. It's like a comedy show. But those are the actual dates. That's the actual documented history. You cannot argue with that. It is inarguable. Now, moving on down the page a little bit, you can see that the interviewer, I also presume that's Marie Steele, asked Miss Orange. She said, "Do you have any questions for me?" And Miss Orange answered, "No, ma'am." Now, further, I want you to note, she had just gone to school yesterday, but she didn't go to school today because, quote unquote, today was Friday, it was a school day. But she didn't today because of this interview, probably. Now, I want you to note the next part. Miss Orange stated, now this is critical, Miss Orange stated, "Mom started asking me questions about my sir, capital S-I-R, when he held my hands behind my back." And then Steele asked, "Who?" And then Orange answered, "Mr. Deskey." That's what you meant by sir. What's that about? Then you can see that Marie Steele then asked, "Well, tell me about him." Now, I want you to think about that inquiry for a second. Marie Steele said specifically, "Tell me about him." Now, I want you to keep in mind here that the him that she's asking Miss Orange about is me. Very same person that they want thrown into a prison. A lot of Foreskin's Johnson's flunkies and henchmen, if you remember, they publicly opined about putting me in prison for life, painting an image of me as some sort of horrible monster who's committed horrible, unspeakable crimes against scores of poor, innocent children, worthy of imprisonment for life. Not joking, but that, by the way, that was their words, and not just then, but even since then, for a decade now, keeping up that act. I want you to remind you that murderers don't automatically get life in prison. Even murderers don't automatically get life in prison, but that's exactly
Yesterday, Mom started asking me questions about my sir. Says when he held my hands behind my back. Feels new, cool, funny, tells me to act like the apple couldn't drop, and here it is again. Everybody everywhere.
You think staying quiet makes you smart? All it does is buy you more time in here. Last chance. Tell me who you were with, now.
I was alone. Okay, I didn't think it would go that far.
That's better.
Than a murderer, right? That's right there in front of you. So what is Miss Orange's answer? How does she put into words from an 8-year-old kid, by the way, how horrible this abuser is? Well, as you can see in the detective's very own handwriting, her answer is this: Mr. Deskey is nice. Exclamation point. Mr. Deskey is cool. Mr. Deskey is funny. Now, I'm still quoting Miss Orange's answer. Here we go. She also says, he lets us do cool stuff. I want you to remember, this kid, who, by the way, absolutely loved coming to Taekwondo class. She was very intelligent, more so than most. So her vocabulary was a little higher than most other 8-year-olds, but words like cool and fun and even nice, they're simple enough that even an attorney or a cop or even some other misanthrope should still be able to understand it. Maybe even a walking foreskin like Jim's Johnson should be able to understand what those words mean. And I want you to remember this too. This document, the actual notes from the actual interview, was among the documents that they tried to hide from me, even as they denied me access to my lawyer, Lori Basham. This is all matter of record stuff. There's no disputing it. This happened. But you never knew this, did you? But still, let's go back to this. What does she mean by, quote, he lets us do cool stuff? Okay, well, what cool stuff? Is sexual abuse? I use that word because that's literally what fonding is, isn't it? Is that abuse? Is that cool stuff? Would some real victim of abuse actually think that her abuser is fun or cool or maybe nice? So that was a problem for Foreskin Johnson, because you can't demonize a guy who's the quote unquote nice guy, according to the actual accuser herself. Yeah, my abuser's so nice. Boy, we do some fun, cool stuff. So there you see it, with your own eyes. Dusky, the fun, cool, nice abuser, stop it. Stop that. None of that, by the way, make a note, none of that even made it into the actual police report. In other words, the police report that they do after these interviews was completely barren, was completely devoid, completely left off this stuff. Nor was the grand jury told any of this. So, surprise, none of that made it into their later police report. It was not presented to the grand jury, which, by the way, that is also a crime. That is also an abuse of their system. So they had to get back on track. So further down the page, you can see Marie Steele kind of prodding a specific thing with that. Your mom asked, and this is what Marie Steele wrote. This is her triggering this statement. Your mom asked you if something happened with Mr. D. Then Miss Orange didn't answer yes. She smartly actually reveals, in her response, that this wasn't some kind of spontaneous reporting, but that someone else, i.e. her mom, had already set the narrative that she was now expected to deliver. So then she actually answered according to the detective's notes, in her own handwriting, you can see here. Miss Yellow had, quote, not Miss Yellow, not Miss Orange, Miss Yellow. Miss Orange is telling the detective that Miss Yellow had told her mom, and
This call is from a federal prison.
Mr. Dusky putting our hands behind our back. End quote. Those are her words. End quote. Now, Miss Orange would have had no possible way of knowing what Miss Yellow might have told her parents. They're two different people, two different households, two different families. The only way that Miss Orange could possibly relate any conversation that Miss Yellow ever had with her mom and with Yellow's mom and dad is if Miss Orange's parents had told Miss Orange the Yellow story. You follow this? You understand? The Orange family could only know what the Yellow family was saying if they had coordinated. Therefore, Miss Orange herself, as you can see here, was the last person to find out exactly what was being said. In other words, what the accusation was going to be. So what was being said? That, quote, Mr. Dusky put our hands behind our back. And, quote, he did that to me, Orange told Steele. That's not all. As you can see here, Marie Steele then asked Miss Orange specifically, where, as in where did this happen? Now, according to the detective's notes, these are not my notes. These are the actual detective's notes, the ones that they tried to hide from us. Orange Girl's answer was, in the total room. Now, that doesn't really make a lot of sense until you consider that the word total bears kind of a slight resemblance to dojo, which means the large open exercise floor. Usually, the image of quote-unquote fondling or molestation in our heads is some secret back room, dark corner type kind of image. That's actually what Marie Steele was kind of hoping to hear, not the primary dojo floor. So she inquired of Orange Girl, was anybody there? Now, obviously, she was hoping that Orange Girl would say, no, we were in some secret back room, but that's not what Orange Girl answered. Remember, This, as you can see here, this hands behind the back thing, Orange Girl already said was in the total room. So her answer to, was anybody there, was also very seriously problematic for the case, because Miss Orange answered, well, yeah, everybody. Wait, what?
Yesterday, Mom started asking me
Everybody
questions
was
about my
there?
sir. Says when he held my
So
hands
as you
behind my
can see
back.
now, with your own
Feels
eyes
new,
now,
cool, funny. Tells me to act
Orange
like the
Girl
apple couldn't drop, and
revealed
here it is again.
that not
Everybody everywhere.
only that everyone was there, but also that everybody was exercising, and, quote, everybody exercising and puts their hands behind their back. That's her own testimony at the time. Wait, what? Now listen, if you've ever been to a Taekwondo school, particularly at a beginner level class, you can start to kind of see what's going on here. Now, to the rest of you all, I'm going to have to enlighten you just a little bit. So when does everybody, quote, who was exercising, as she said here, put their hands behind their backs? Okay, this is what's known as the Bahro stance. And even though the word is Korean, everyone else on the planet is familiar with the stance. Most of you actually call it at ease. And it is no different, really, than the military at ease stance. Only instead of at ease, we say baro. Feet shoulder width, hands behind your back, just over your butt. It's kind of a relaxed position. In fact, sometimes the command for it,
This call is from a federal prison.
shuk, which is an attention stance, and then bow, is simply that. We say, and relax. That's when you go to the at ease stance. At white belt level, the level that Miss Yellow had just passed through, and they have to pass off on those 5 basic stances. The required ones are the front stance, the back stance, the sitting stance, the attention stance, the chumbi stance. All of those are required, but I want you to notice that the at ease stance, in other words, bahro, the one with your hands behind your back, that's not one of those required stances from white belt. So instructors don't really sweat it if you don't pick that one up until yellow. But the basic 5, those require constant adjustment sometimes, constant manipulation and correction by instructors at white belt level. In fact, often beyond. Now we're talking about a discipline here which requires precision, absolute precision when it comes to, there's no oh, let them be, it has to be precise. Everything has to always be precise when it comes to angles, weight distribution, all the other factors. We instructors, we aren't just physically correcting in inches, but we're correcting in microns. So we're not going to sweat you, the baro, the at ease stance, much until your yellow belt level, because that stance, when, as Orange Girl told Marie Steele, as you can read, everybody puts their hands behind their back, the baro stance, is not a crisis. Any adjustment to it would be very brief, but certainly not something that would be abusive. Now, the next line, though, which happens to be the last line here, where they really tried to hang their hat, that's the line that we're going to come to in part 3.